if we wanted to talk about efficiency and good audience reach in the church, then becoming a YouTube preacher that you preach in the digital space
on really controversial topics, for example.
Yeah, maybe controversial topics, but if it would be efficient if I was to preach to 1,000-person auditorium and had 10,000 people on YouTube, and for the same amount of preparation time for my sermon as I give to 80 people on Sunday morning, then I'm reaching 25,000 people. So there's efficiencies there. So is efficiency a good thing? Maybe, but also there's all those other things that we talk about long-term, low-key relational discipleship that you cannot do in a 1,000-person church. You cannot do digitally. You can't have deep discipleship, long-term, low-key relationships with an audience of 20,000 on a YouTube channel. It just it can't work like that. We're built to be incarnate.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast, and it is excellent to have you along with us. Apologise for no episode last week. We had a few things going on, part of Soul Revival staff, but I have one of the Soul Revival staff joining me. Tim, welcome back.
Thank you. I wasn't here last week. So
no, you weren't.
Probably contributed to...
And I think we should talk about that because you were in Chicago.
I was.
For like a whirlwind trip to Chicago, I would say.
Yeah, 6 days I think I was there. I was out of Australia for 6 days. So that includes almost 2 days of travel. So it was...
Oh, and you lose a day coming back.
Well, you live one day twice, then you miss one day the other way. So it's
so weird, isn't it?
It's a bit weird.
Isn't it interesting they just put the international date line at that point? Like, I know there's ideas around why they do that, but isn't it funny? You're at a certain point, you go back a day.
I guess you have to put it somewhere, but
that's right.
In a global world. But yes,
a global world.
Global world? Is that a tautology?
World is very global. It's just one. This global world.
Globe. So globular.
Yeah, that's right. So tell us, I remember we prefaced this, you going to Chicago a number of months ago.
Okay.
Let's reiterate, why did you go? You were going to a children's ministry conference?
Yeah, so it's called the Children's Spirituality Summit. And it's a conference that runs every second year, has for quite a while, long before I've sort of been aware of it. I've known of this conference for a while, but this is the first chance I've had to go to this particular conference. It has a sister conference called Intergenerate, which is largely about intergenerational ministry. I've been to that twice now.
Okay.
But this is the first time I've been to the Children's Spirituality one. So yeah, it's just a collection of very broad group of people from all different theological perspectives, denominational perspectives. There's Catholics there, there's mainlines, there's evangelicals, there's all sorts of different types of evangelicals, different countries represented, and so broadly all together because they want to be passionate about how do you foster the, they would say, spiritual life of the child. We can talk about what that means, but all interested in that idea and wanting to do that together. And what I really like about these conferences is that there's not a very high anxiety on those theological differences. People can interact with those things, sometimes robustly discuss those things. So often it's more like, okay, you come from that perspective, that's cool. You come from that perspective, that's cool. I come from this perspective, that's cool. We're all here to think about how do you help children grow as disciples of Jesus. And so when I hear the Catholic speak from her perspective, Maria was there, and I go, okay, that's cool. Like, I know you're coming from this perspective, but you're passionate about children becoming disciples of Jesus. And then someone who might be mainline, who might be theologically and culturally a lot more progressive than I am, they speak from their perspective, and that's okay. And then I speak from a reformed, evangelical, quite conservative point of view, and they go, yeah, of course. And so there's this sharing of ideas without anyone feeling like they have to be anxious and defend particular theological doctrines. And if it does come down to a doctrinal or theological conversation, we then talk about those in a really respectful, healthy way that says, oh, okay, I can see what you're doing there. Here's how I read that passage of scripture, or here's what I think evangelical means, or those kinds of conversations. And I mean, personally, I find that really exciting and refreshing. I think I tend towards being more of a peacemaker kind of person who just wants to get along and be friends with people and not have, not let disagreements get in the way of constructive conversation. I think that's where I am that's how God's made my personality. So I find these kind of get-togethers quite exciting and stimulating. So
what do you think fosters that kind of low tension around that? Because some Christian conferences may not have that. What do you think? Is it perhaps because it's about children rather than adults just kind of at loggerheads with each other? Or
I mean, maybe. I don't know. About the conference itself, I'm not quite sure what that fosters, whether it's just the conveners there. I mean, it might be that so many of the people there would be more moderate or even progressive in their theology and cultural understandings, and therefore come with their natural disposition is, anything goes, everything's fine. Whereas those who tend towards the more conservative view are rightly trying to conserve particular theologies. Like, that's the whole idea, that there are things that we want to hold true and hold on to. And that can exhibit itself in some of these relationships as being defensive. And I think, I don't know, again, this is part of my personality, I think, is that I hold, conservative theological and often cultural positions on a lot of things. But for me, that doesn't err towards defensiveness. And maybe that's my own, conflict avoidance and just wanting to be, a peacemaker, that I don't find it exciting to go in and have to conserve to the point of defending this. I can go in confident of what I believe and then enter these conversations. But again, for better or worse, I mean, maybe I'm wrong in that. I don't know.
That's interesting. What are you learning about? How does those different perspectives help you consolidate or perhaps reform some parts of your thinking around children's ministry?
I think what I find helpful is if I hear someone who comes from a radically different theological perspective to mine, whether that be a denominational perspective or whether it be a different type of theology, a different reading of scripture or a different understanding of the church or whatever it might be, then but they're arguing for strong inclusion of children or really robust theology of the child so that we can take children's ministry really seriously, then the curiosity of my mind goes, oh, that's really interesting. I would agree with your outcome but differ from your starting point. So where have you come from in order to argue strongly for really good, robust child theology that helps with us take children's ministry and children's spirituality very seriously? I come from a different point of view, but I want to end up in a very similar space. So let's think about that. So it can help me clarify and go, oh, okay, well, how would I argue for a very similar outcome, but from my perspective, and what might differ therefore in the way we articulate those things?
Have you got an example? Maybe something that came from the conference.
I can't think of anything particular from the conference necessarily. It's still kind of running around in my head. I need to
still probably jet lagged.
Yeah, I probably am still jet lagged or just sleep deprived. Let's take an intergenerational example. Yep. So there are a number of those who would be less conservative in the intergenerational world, who would raise, sort of lower some of the passages that talk about right authority in the churches and say, no, let's raise up children because they can be just as much a conduit of the Holy Spirit into this community than others. And so that can lend the perspective to saying leaders should get out of the way. Leaders, you shouldn't be influencing too much authority or coercion or guidance for the child. If they are speaking, we would both believe that children can be saved, therefore can be have the Holy Spirit in them, and that would lend some to say, therefore, when a child speaks in church, they're prophesying perhaps, and they're able to speak just as authoritatively as others. And so I would listen to that and go, okay, that's really curious. I can see what you're doing there. You know, priesthood of all believers, yes. All co-adopted by Christ, yes. And yet, I think from a more conservative point of view, I would say there are still those passages in 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus where there's a really important high value of leadership and a high importance of those who speak authoritatively need to be selected carefully, need to be firmed in many things, need to be mature in faith. And so...
They also take on more responsibility.
And take on more responsibility, yeah. So I think that might be one kind of balance where, you know, some of my intergenerational friends will want to de-emphasise authority and emphasise the ability for children to prophesy and speak God's word into the community. I hear that and I go, okay, I can see some of that, but also I don't want to diminish those authority. I think there's still importance in authority, that God places authority in particular people for the good of his church. Ephesians 4, you know, God appoints pastors, teachers, shepherds to equip the saints so that we all grow in maturity to Christ. So I wouldn't want to de-emphasise all authority in the church or around a table or whatever. I think that there is right authority. So that might be one example where that conversation happens.
On the flip side of that conversation, how do you go with feeling like they're accepting of your perspective? You say reformed, evangelical, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm never quite sure how to define myself in these. Sort of like, is it reformed, evangelical, conservative, confessional, Anglican? I mean, there's just so many words.
Yeah, which really just mean a whole lot of other things. That it's interesting, like that, which can create that tension that you're talking about with, like, oh, I'm this word, the labels. Yeah,
part of my problem with labels is I might mean something by that label, and the hearer might hear something else. So there are going to be particular parts in America, particularly, where you say, oh, I'm an evangelical, they will front load that term with a lot of the cultural and potentially political beliefs. And, so that means you're right-leaning, Republican, gun-affirming, Trump voting, all of these kind of stuff. And, you know, I would say, well, actually, I mean, I've got no skin in the American game. So all of those political, cultural things have no bearing on me. And I would disagree with some of those things as well. But again, the problem with labels is people hear, I package that label with particular things in my mind, they've got a package, and if you just use the label without further defining, there can be this miscommunication of they assume particular things. So, yeah. And again, a big theme of the podcast is take time, slow down, have meaningful conversations over a greater length of time. And I think that is helpful. So if I was to sit down with someone and they say, oh, you're an evangelical, I'd say, oh, well, I would use that label. Well, let's talk about what that means. Let's unpack that so that you can actually, you're not just assuming things of me and I'm not assuming things of you if you say such and such. There was one lady I talked to who said that she was post-evangelical. And I said, okay, tell me about that. Right. What do you mean by that? Yeah. It was a fleeting conversation. It wasn't as deep as I would have otherwise liked it to be. But there are particular pockets of, I think largely the American church, you probably find some of it in Australia, that they would say there's trauma associated with the word evangelical. They've seen the word evangelical used as a political rather than a religious connotation. They've seen abuses in the church, whether it be financial abuse or sexual abuse or all sorts of things that go on. And that's made them distrust that label and say, well, I don't want to use that label, but I don't know what else I am if I still affirm that, tenets of the Bible and Jesus is Lord. And so, but again, it all comes down to labels, right? Like, what do you do with all these things? It was really interesting.
Did you get any response? Was that the really only response you got from that person that you spoke to, or there was? Yeah, again, it was much more fleeting than I would have. Okay. I would have had the conversation, but it was kind of morning tea, and we just kind of slowly passing each other. So, like, what's that? Like, what post-evangelical? That's a new one. I haven't heard that kind of thing. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. They may be coming up with terms to distance themselves from certain things. That's where kind of a lot of labels come from, isn't it? Yeah. You spoke at the conference. Yes. Yeah, I shared some of the things that I've been reading. Hopefully writing about, but I haven't actually got that far yet. So my sort of big, potentially lifelong project is
I really want to sort of think about what's going on in an intergenerational church that helps form the faith of children. And so, I mean, there's theological aspects to that, but I'm particularly fascinated by what social scientists can tell us about what happens developmentally and within the social system that actually means that when we tell the stories of the gospel to the next generation, and we do that in the context of community, there are things that we can notice are going on for children and for the community that will help us understand why that works. So the image I always use at the start of all my presentations is the Fast and the Furious. I've got this one particular picture of, was it Vin Diesel and Paul Walker
Yep.
standing in front of a car with the bonnet open, and they're just looking at the engine.
Yep.
And so I talk about, I want to get under the hood of what makes intergenerational ministry work. And so that's looking at developmental psychology, it's looking at social science, it's looking at the big term is socio-cultural development, which is basically how do we develop within the social situation we find ourselves in. So the big name of this from history is a guy called Lev Vygotsky.
Yep.
So he was a Russian. Anyone who's done education will know his name. Fascinating that he was born in the 30s, did his work, what would have been 50s, 60s, 50s? Yeah. And but he was working in Russia under the Soviets, who weren't a big fan of what he was doing and the institution that he was with. He died very young, 30-something, of tuberculosis. And because he was working in Russia under the Soviets and because they didn't particularly like his work, it basically got buried. And so the West, the English-speaking world, didn't know anything about Vygotsky for decades later. And it took a number of decades for his work to start to trickle out into the English-speaking world and then get translated. And so during that time, there was another guy, Piaget, who those in development...
Jean Piaget.
Mm-hmm. So he was in Switzerland, actually fascinatingly born the same year as Lev Vygotsky,
Wow.
but working in the West, a lot of his stuff being translated directly into English very soon after. And so he dominated the field of educational developmental psychology for a very long time. And his argument was all about stages, that you get to a particular stage, then you're ready for the next stage of learning, and that your external experience doesn't really affect what's happening internally, because your internal is kind of like a seed of a tree, that all that you're going to be is there inside of you in terms of developmental stages. You just have to wait for the right stage before you can start inputting the information. Vygotsky is reading Piaget in Russia and responding to him. So he quotes Piaget a lot.
Oh, okay.
And he's often saying, hey, Piaget is saying this, but actually I think there's more going on in the social system, and that actually the social system that you are involved in is making a massive difference to your development. So now Vygotsky wasn't talking about faith formation, he wasn't talking about Christianity or spirituality or any of those kind of things. But it's when I'm reading his writings, I think, oh, this is so obvious. He's noticing things that we can say, oh, in the church, I think this is happening. And when I read his stuff, read this one guy, James Estep, who was using Vygotsky to talk about faith formation. And I thought, this is so obvious. Like, oh, everyone must be writing about this because it's so clear. So then I started looking for I just assumed that all of these children's ministry academics would be talking about Vygotsky. And no one was. I just thought, okay, I must be doing this wrong. Something's going wrong here. So I ended up on the phone to James Estep in America. This is many, many years ago. And I said, where's all this writing? Because, I mean, surely everyone's talking about this. And he said, actually, no, I can't find anyone either. So there was only a very small number of people. So I just think, oh, that's really fascinating. But so that idea of socio-cultural learning, that the social situation you are in impacts your development. And therefore, if we turn that into a church setting, the quality and the types of relationships you have in an intergenerational church, or non-generational church, but it will impact the child's faith formation.
Yeah.
And so what I think is that if you have a good intergenerational church where the child feels that they belong into this community, and they're hearing the stories of this community, including the faith stories of this community, so the gospel stories and the Old Testament narratives and the Acts of the Apostles and church history, as well as the stories of this particular church, that is growing that sense of identity in the child, and therefore they are growing in their knowledge and love and obedience to King Jesus. And I suspect that will help form strong, lifelong faith in children. So that's kind of the background. The stuff I talked about, relatively new even to me, but it's the same idea following on from this. And there's this concept called the autobiographical self. So your story that you tell yourself comes from your memories.
Yep.
And it also comes from your vicarious memories, the memories that you weren't there for, but you've taken on as part of your identity.
Okay.
So as you talk to your kids about the time that you and Karen met, and some of your early dates and your wedding day and what that was like, obviously your kids weren't there for any of that. But if you tell those stories in such a way that they come to hear, oh, this is part of my story. To be a McMaster means to take on these stories. Like, I am the son of Karen and Joel who met in this way and had this kind of wedding and are being part of this kind of relationships. Karen, Latvia, is that her?
Yeah, part of her family's from Latvia. Yep.
All right, so that's going to be part of your kids' identity.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if they've ever been to Latvia.
No, we'd like to, but we haven't.
So as yet, they haven't been part of that, but it's part of who they are. And the more that they talk to Karen and Karen's family, and they eat Latvian food, and they read about Latvian culture, and they learn about why is it that they have family who were from Latvia that are now in Australia, all of that becomes part of their autobiographical self. So again, translating into the church, our kids weren't around at the time of Jesus. They didn't see him do that. But if they're in a faith community who takes the stories of Jesus seriously and are seeking
an eternal Father,
and the narrative of the Old Testament, which tell us who we are, as they take on all those stories for themselves, I think what social scientists are noticing is why it is that if that is very real to that congregation and they're raising those kids up to know those stories and to genuinely have those stories for themselves. And so our kids grow up knowing, oh yeah, that's my God, that's my Jesus, and I'm part of this story because it's part of my community, then that helps build a robust autobiographical self, which includes that spiritual or faith side.
I see.
Anyway, that's a lot of social theory, but...
Well, I really enjoyed it though. I can see like why you're so passionate about it. It seems like it's a relatively unexplored area, which is fun.
As far as I can tell, but I mean, I may have just missed someone. But
I also feel like there's a book in the works there, Tim.
Oh,
it's in the brain. It's in the brain.
It's in the brain. Yeah. I mean, there is a book that I'm editing a manuscript for a book at the moment that we're looking forward to get published towards the end of the year.
Awesome.
And some of this will come into it. Yeah.
What was the reaction if you presented something like that at the conference? What was the reaction? Did you get people talking about it and you're like, oh, that's something I haven't heard before, or exciting?
Yeah, a few people came up and, I mean, I joked during my presentation about I just assumed everyone was doing this and I couldn't find anyone. What was I doing wrong? And I had a few people come up to me afterwards and say, yeah, no, that makes sense. So people talking that. There was one lady, Karen Marie, who she had some extra right. Like she's about a generation or so older than I am. Then she has been doing children's ministry research for much longer. She shared some ideas, so I took down some notes quickly from her. There was one guy, Henry Zonio, who is a sociologist teaching at a Christian university, and we had lots of good conversations because he's a sociologist, he's coming at it from a social science point of view. So we just had lots of good fun talking back and forward, and he was sort of encouraged that someone else is thinking sociologically about child faith development and how these worlds kind of interact with each other. So yeah, I mean, there weren't any real deep feedbacks or critical commentary, but people were very affirming and lovely, and they all like the Australian accent because they think it's weird. And
they do. They love the Australian accent in America, don't they? They're like, oh, yep, that's just how we talk.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
Yeah. What were your impressions of Chicago?
The city?
Yeah.
I spent about 12 hours No, not quite 24 hours downtown. And that was, I really like the city.
It's cool, isn't it?
It's a very cool city. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that there are not nice places in Chicago, like areas, but all the places I went to were nice, lovely. Like the architecture is just amazing. There's huge amounts of green space.
Did you do the boat tour?
I did the boat tour.
Yes.
The architectural cruise.
Yeah.
Up and down the
good, eh?
river. Yeah, it was really cool.
Yeah.
Just fascinating to hear some of the history of different things, the different architectural styles. I know more about architectural theory than I think I've ever known before.
Very good.
So yeah, it was lots of fun. And then after I'd finished the tour, I knew that the Christopher Nolan Batman movies had been filmed in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And so I went around trying to find location.
I think didn't you post the bank heist?
Yeah, the bank heist.
Because that's the introduction to the Joker, right? That Heath Ledger version of the Joker, isn't it? That
So at the very start of Dark Knight, which is the second movie in Nolan's trilogy, is this big bank heist. And so the building itself is the old Chicago post office. It's now no longer a post office, it's now corporate suites. But that foyer that you walk into is pretty much exactly like the bank tellers you see in that first scene of The Dark Knight. So I took some photos in there and photos of the outside where you see the bus crash through. And
oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that happens, doesn't it?
Yeah. So saw all of that.
You had a deep dish pizza?
Had a deep dish pizza. Amazing.
Yeah?
So good. Yeah.
Cool. I don't know if I actually had it. I have to remember when I went if I actually had it. It was a long time ago. But
yeah, no, I got told a couple of places to go. So a good friend of mine, Robin, from the UK, he came and spent the afternoon and evening with me downtown. Yeah. And so, we wandered around a lot, but then we went and found deep dish pizza and then found a blues club, which was very cool.
Beautiful.
So, yeah.
Oh, great. Well, it sounds like you had a fun trip, but there was a lot on.
It was a lot on, but it was good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, let's move on. In regards to our last episode, was you and Fee were on it, we talked about a lot to do with like Twitch streaming and video game streaming and things like that. And one of the, I suppose we're going to make this our cultural artifact, if you like, that one of the people that I mentioned in the streamers I watch is a guy called Jimmy Broadbent.
You've had an update.
I have. I've got an update on him. It's really interesting, and it really called out a lot of the things we were trying to work through on that particular episode. So he recently posted a video saying how I became a full-time YouTuber, and I watched the whole thing, 35 minutes or something like that. It was really cool because he went back over like some of his old content and things like that and said, "Oh, look how bad this was," and like the thing I like about Jimmy is he uses a lot of humor to whatever he's doing. But in the end, we'll go back in a second, but in the end, it came to the point where he's basically like, I don't enjoy what I'm doing anymore. And he's full credit to him saying that to his audience, because now it is things like needing to make sure it fits it in the algorithm. What's the thumbnail like? What's the content going to be like? Am I going to get enough clicks on it? Am I going to make enough money to keep remaining a full-time YouTuber? And he contrasted that to the fact that he wanted to say in part of that video that streaming racing games online basically saved his life, he thinks, because he had a huge mental breakdown with a lot of things going on in his life in terms of family members. I know he had a relationship breakdown, and he didn't enjoy his job. He was drinking a lot, all those kind of things. And this is what I like about him. He's quite authentic. And he said that just the one thing he felt like he had in his life was doing racing simulations online, and basically coming up with random challenges to see if he could do it, and just recording it and spending ages trying to do it and then eventually getting it. And that's where his audience built it. And he was posting a video almost every single day. To build up his audience, and he said that's the bit he loves. And then now he's kind of distanced himself from that a little bit. He's actually working more on an actual racing career, actually driving true racing cars.
Yeah.
And he's saying that he doesn't enjoy what he does now. So he's enjoyed the journey building up to it, and now he's almost, I think he's over 1 million subscribers now, or close to. I was actually, no, it's 935,000 it was saying he had. And he's like, now I've got to get over that, I've got to play the YouTube game, and I don't enjoy doing that as much.
Yeah, right.
And I thought it played into a lot of things that we were talking about in that episode of what is the end goal kind of thing, and what is the true contribution to society, or and it can become unfulfilling at some point, whereas like video games can fulfill a certain individualistic need to make something happen and build something happen, but then in the end it's still only a video game. It's not that true and that physical representation of things like that.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty cool. So, and I'll link that in the show notes if you want to check that out. It's actually a really nice video to watch because he's really authentic about it and says, "Oh yeah, I'm struggling with this. I'm finding this hard. So I don't know where I'm at right now."
Yeah.
And then he's just started doing. You noticing he started doing a couple more videos that are more just like what he wanted to do, like back in similar to what he used to do back in the day. So I thought that was interesting. Any reactions to that?
Yeah. Well, you maybe think of the Matt D'Avella. So Matt D'Avella.
Oh, the minimalist guy.
He's a minimalist.
Yep.
Yeah, and he did a video. What's the posting? 31st December 2023. And
I believe he's moved to Australia, that guy.
Oh, has he?
I think he lives in
that.
Australia. Yeah, he's
Right.
I think his girlfriend's Australian.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I mean, maybe he was part of it. In this video, he basically says, it's called I'm on my own again. And what he processes through this video is he was so successful as a minimalist podcaster on YouTube that he then built a team around him, and then built the complexity of it, and he had this minimalist empire of his
lots
stuff.
of people and lots of things.
massive production values and lots of things going on. And similar to who's your productivity guy that you like on YouTube?
Ali Abdaal.
Ali Abdaal, like he talks about his team.
It's done the same thing, yeah.
He's got this whole team that he works with, and like there's 6 or 7 people who work on his YouTube videos with him. And Matt D'Avella had kind of built a similar kind of thing. He had this team of lots of people depending on him for work. He was paying bills, he was managing salaries, and he was doing all of this stuff in this massive empire. And he came to the same realization as Broadband that he
Broadbent.
That actually, I don't think I like what I'm doing. And as a convicted minimalist, he was also wondering, creating all these videos on minimalism, am I actually undermining my own minimalist philosophy by creating this enormous system that is dependent on, playing the algorithm game and making the right movies and doing all this kinds of stuff. And so in this video, he kind of deconstructs that, and he ended up basically deconstructing his whole system and his whole team. He ended up, saying to the people, "Thank you so much. Here's a severance package," and cutting everyone else out and back to himself. And part of it was that whole realization that what got me here, what I enjoyed doing, that got picked up by the algorithms that managed to become famous, that I then built a whole brand on. The running of the company that is Matt D'Avella was nowhere near as enjoyable or fulfilling as what it was when I was actually just making the videos that I liked about myself and about what minimalism meant for me and those kinds of things. So I just thought that, again, it's a similar kind of story of I built up this thing, like I've succeeded in the game of YouTube, and yet what it's produced is a lifestyle that is not actually fulfilling. That there's something, it's just not it's not hitting in the right space. I don't know what the phrasing is. I'm struggling for words, but
I wonder if that's a difference between someone who just wants to be a creator or someone that wants to. I mean, I feel like the two different contrasts to that are a creator versus an entrepreneur. Whereas that's Ali Abdaal. Something that he's talked about again is, he built an empire. He's built this massive empire on YouTube. He sells courses that are called the Part-Time YouTuber Academy, where he's trying to show people how to do the same thing. And he likes teaching people and he likes creating content, but now he has to run a business at the same time. And he doesn't. I don't think he wants to devolve that from, he doesn't want to do that as much. And I find it sounds like it's similar with Matt D'Avella when there's other people who come from a different angle and go, I've built businesses, for example, I've done all this, here's what I did. So they're more just teaching. And there's like, these are all my experiences, this is what I'm teaching. So they don't see the content as a way of producing a living. They've produced a living outside of that and are now creating content to further feed a different machine that they've created prior.
Interesting.
So I feel like there's two differences between that, because if you're a creator and your fulfillment comes from just creating things, then if you're being pulled away from that, I don't think you're going to find that as fulfilling. So that's kind of sounds like where it sounds.
It's the entrepreneur that becomes a long-term CEO of their company that they built, and it's just like, actually, I just like creating new things, and here I am stuck running something that I'm not sure how to get rid of. Whereas there's those entrepreneurs that invent a product or come up with a system that they can monetize, they build up for 5 years and then sell to someone else. And they don't care what they do with it. It's because for them, the joy was in building something new and creating. And so that's a sustainable thing for them.
Here's a difference. And there's a guy called, some people may not like him, he's a bit of a bro, but there's a guy called Alex Hormozy, and his plan is, so he helped people launch gyms. Then he went into he created a software business, and there was a couple of other ones that he's done. But he basically has a holding company that he invests into businesses. But what he now is doing is a whole lot of content on his YouTube channel is, I want to get you to give you all this content for free so you can get to $1 to $3 million in revenue. So then I can invest in your business to help you grow, and I get obviously the cut out of that business to grow my empire, kind of thing. I thought that was a really interesting way to do it. And I'm finding there's more entrepreneurs doing that now than previously. I found a couple others last night, actually. I'm like, this guy's like, here's my sales process, my 24 minutes on my sales process. I'll give it to you for free, kind of thing. Yeah. And there's a lot more of that. So
it reminds me of a cynical take by a guy called Alan Noble, who's a Christian author. And he wrote, he's got this running sarcastic meme thing that he's been doing for the last month or a bit called Noble Words. And one of them was something along the lines of, there's no money in writing books, but there is money in writing 10-week courses on how to write a book. So come and join my 10-week course on how to run a 10-week course to how to write a book.
It's that productizing yourself thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And even Ali Abdal's, you got the, I can make YouTube videos, or I can teach you how to make YouTube videos, and you pay me heaps more money than I get making YouTube videos. And you're just monetizing that cycle.
It is the creator economy, I think.
The creator economy, yes.
Called it. So you get experiences, you create something, and then you sell what you learn. Yeah.
So what's the Christian version of this?
That's what I'm wondering. I'm trying to get to that. And maybe we're kind of doing it in this podcast. Well, are we ahead of the times, Tim?
Oh, well, there we go. There might be a little bit of that and we've talked about this as, Soul Revival and doing the Shock Absorber podcast and doing the Shock Absorber conference that we did a couple of years ago is, again, you've kind of got this, the Stu's imagining of, okay, how do you make disciples in long-term, low-key relational community, which is, very crassly, a different product to what was common, certainly at the time, and differentiates itself a fair amount from what we find often in churches even today. And part of the reason that you wanted to start this content was, that's such a good story and articulation of how to do good, faithful gospel ministry, that we want to communicate that in a way that is helpful to others to learn from. Now, we haven't monetized this yet. You can subscribe to our Patreon account. No, there's no Patreon account.
No, you can't, actually.
There's no subscribe to my Substack.
Yes, Tim's got a Substack, so do I.
Don't. Oh, yeah, because we both
do.
The difference is you actually have content on yours.
Not too much.
I created a page, and it has no. I'm pretty sure I haven't populated anything on it yet.
Yeah.
Yep. But I'm just trying to think, like, what is that? But I also want to sort of pull apart the crassness of monetizing discipleship. Like, and it's interesting. We've been teaching through 1 Corinthians at the moment, and you've got a couple of weeks ago I preached on the bit where Paul gives up his rights to be paid for the ministry, and he's got this interesting balance that he's tossing around. Is I've actually got the right to be paid. You should have supported me financially when I came, because that is biblical. It's in line with scriptures. It's a right model of how preachers of the gospel ought to be financially supported by those that they preach the gospel to. And he lays all of that out. And then he says, and I didn't ask you for any of that, and I'm glad that I didn't, because I wouldn't have been beholden to you, and it was an opportunity to give up my freedoms and to give up my rights for the sake of you, and all this back and forth. And so there is this, I think ministry and money is always really tense. Like it's complicated. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier, there are some in even the evangelical church who have abused financially the money that comes in, and have used it inappropriately or squandered the money, or right through to high fraud kind of things. But at the same time, there is that responsibility that if you are preaching the gospel to people and you are receiving gospel ministry from your team at church, that you financially put money towards them. You actually help support them. And we talk in the Anglican Church particularly about it's a stipend, not a wage, in that we're actually providing money to free you up to do ministry. And
to set aside.
Like that's right. Yeah. Which is different often to what some people talk about being a tent making ministry, which is taken directly from Paul. Like, he literally was a tent maker. It's now used as a metaphor for saying, I pay my bills by doing this work outside the church, but then I can come and serve the church in this particular ways. And the idea of a stipend is saying, well, you could do tent making ministry. I could go stack shelves at Kmart. That could pay, food on the table, school clothes for my kids, and then pay outside of that. But actually the church has said, no, we want to set you aside and we want to organise a stipend for you so that you are freed from having to sell shoes, be a lawyer, be a banker, be a whatever, and instead can give more of your time to the service of the church and ministering to the people of God. And so that's the right model. It's a difficult balance between doing a product for service. and I tried to draw this out a little bit in my sermon was, church is not a product that you're consuming. And a mistake would be to come and go, oh yeah, that was a $20 sermon this week, and I didn't know that sermon. I'm going to go put $15 in the plate this week, or to think, I'm going to be away for a fortnight, so I'm going to miss 2 sermons, a Bible study, and a coffee with Stu. So I'll reduce my giving this week because I'm not going to get from the church the things that I would normally get. Like, I don't know if anyone thinks like that, but that kind of crass one-for-one correspondence of I get this product from the church and therefore I, receive this. It's a different heart attitude from both the minister but also from the congregation member, that you're not subscribing to a podcast feed and paying a Patreon account because you get a particular product, which is the sermon, from your minister. It's it's right for me to take leadership from you, to have the gospel preached to me from you, to apply it to my life. And therefore it's right for me to financially support that minister in their ministry so that they can be freed up to do that for me and for many, many others as well. Which is then hard to work out, okay, what does that look like in this kind of entrepreneurial space? And is there a correlation? Is there not?
Well, there's always the danger, isn't it, of sometimes we allow business thinking to creep into the church. And I know you've brought that before. You don't like a lot of those metaphors. Like I think a few weeks ago we talked about what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah, that's right.
And those kind of things. And I think it's something that I've maybe grappled with a fair bit in terms of, because I do enjoy entrepreneurial thinking and about business and things like that. So, but again, like it's a different thing. The gospel is, well, the gospel on itself is different, isn't it? But it transforms our thinking as well. And, even if you think of the imagery of God being a shepherd leader rather than an entrepreneurial leader, the two things are quite different. And I think, but in a discussion even we had with Karen back in when we were doing looking at breakout churches, was often it would be to separate this kind of business-like thinking away from churches. But in the end, what actually ended up happening from the research that Tom Rainer did in breakout churches showed that businesses and churches that adopted similar principles often ended up having similar results in their particular field.
Yeah.
And I find that quite interesting, is that actually if we were shepherd leaders perhaps in other areas of our life, we may see some real benefit to that too. So I suppose where I'm trying to get to is that what do you hold on to in both those realms, and what do you let go and say, no, that doesn't fit biblically, for example? Yeah,
we need to keep holding every model, whether it's a management model or a shepherding model or a entrepreneurial model, up to Scripture, and they will all fall short. And this is, one of Augustine's great insights when he talked about the city of God and city of man, is that these are constantly intertwined with each other, which means that everything we look at, every person we look at, every institution we look at, every structure we look at, will always have both the city of God and the city of man intertwined with each other. And so we can look at all these things and go, okay, what's the good here? What is the helpful, what can we draw from this that is in line with God's creational design, and which part is fallen, which part actually is corrupting and distorting and can be taken in a way that would create an idolatry of particular areas, or would be dehumanizing. If we wanted to talk about efficiency and good audience reach in the church, then becoming a YouTube preacher that you preach in the digital space
on really controversial topics, for example.
Maybe controversial topics, but if it would be efficient if I was to preach to 1,000-person auditorium and had 10,000 people on YouTube, and for the same amount of preparation time for my sermon as I give to 80 people on Sunday morning, then I'm reaching 25,000 people. So there's efficiencies there. So is efficiency a good thing? Maybe, but also there's all those other things that we talk about long-term, low-key relational discipleship that you cannot do in a 1,000-person church. You cannot do digitally. You can't have deep discipleship, long-term, low-key relationships with an audience of 20,000 on a YouTube channel. It just it can't work like that. We're built to be incarnate. And so therefore, is efficiency a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it could be. There could be things in there that are helpful. We don't want to necessarily strive for inefficiency, but inefficiency can go wrong. Efficiency can go wrong.
Inefficiency can go wrong.
Inefficiency can go wrong as well. And so thinking about those kinds of things, about how do you take the best of these? But Scripture is always our lens through which we assess these things, and keep coming back to, okay, what does the Bible tell us about God's good design, about life in this world, the corruption that all of these institutions and ideologies and philosophies and particular perspectives might have. Does it help us to flourish according to a Genesis 1-2 vision, or is it going to dehumanize, deconstruct, and hinder in a Genesis 3-4 kind of way? And they're the questions I think it's worth keep asking.
Well, I'm glad that you I feel like there's three things that I wanted to kind of hit on there from what you were saying though. What were those three terms that you said previously? There was, but there's kind of things that's in God's order that we can.
Sorry. I think you're talking about So I think I picked it up from John Walton. I don't know if it's his idea or someone else's, but there's formed, unformed, and deformed.
That's it.
Is that it?
Yep.
Okay. So God forms in Genesis 1. So he creates. But he doesn't do all of the work of creation. He gives that to Adam and Eve. Go and subdue the earth, rule over it. In Genesis 2, Adam needs a helper, so he creates Eve out of the rib of Adam to be his helper, his partner in this creational mandate. And so they are continue to take the unformed and form it. So there are still things in our creation that are unformed, and that we, as the human race, we live in line with God's creational ordinance when we continue to form the unformed. But the thing that Genesis 3 brings in with the fall is that God's good creation can be deformed. So there can be things that are broken and distorted and destructive and that are under God's judgment because they are deformed rather than just unformed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. But then what's the one that we work on together?
We're working on the process of forming the unformed.
That's right, forming the unformed. Yeah, that's what I was trying to think of. Yeah,
yep.
Cool. Well, I was just relating to that is we need to, you often mention that word incarnate, and thinking about watching that Jimmy Broadbent video of saying, this provided me a way out of all my mental health struggles and things that I was struggling with, and I created a community around it and people were great. But now he has probably evolved as a person. But he's like, it's created these amazing opportunities. I earn money by making videos, doing things that I liked, but there's a limit to it. There's a limit to where it's taken me to, and now I'm starting to realize, there's a whole lot of things that are unfulfilling in that. So then the next thing that I wanted to link with that, just stick with me now though. I just read Vygotsky's, one of his most important theories was the zone of proximal development.
Yep.
Which means that there's a gap between a child's current level of development and the level they are capable of reaching.
Yes.
With the tools provided by others for more knowledge.
Yep.
Okay, now, so you hold those two things.
Okay.
And then the next thing is this book that I wanted to talk about, which I've just started reading. I'm holding it up in the camera if you can see it. It's called Faith For Exiles by David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock. And one of the things there, and I wanted to just recall on a number of things that you've talked about today, is what these two authors talk about is the subtitle of the book is 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. And it uses the idea of, and it plays into a lot of things we're talking about discipleship. This is where I'm trying to get to with this. It plays into a lot of things we're talking about discipleship in terms of the American church especially. That's what this book is based on. I believe Dave Kinnaman is some bigwig at Barna Research.
I think he's the head of Barna, which is a really significant research institute in America.
And focuses on 18 to 29-year-olds, a lot of the research that he uses for this book.
Yep.
But he uses the idea of that his previous book showed that many Americans were leaving the church mainly, he thinks, from analysing the research from a lack of discipleship.
Yep.
And he uses the story of the Israelites, which happens a lot in Daniel, where basically saying they were originally in Jerusalem, were exiled to Babylon, right? So, but the problem that we're doing in churches is we're discipling as if we're in a modern day Jerusalem, where truly, or more accurately, the world is a modern day Babylon. So the Babylon is like a modern day Babylon is you have access to everything. Anything you want, whenever you want, any time of the day, a digital Babylon, as he calls it.
Yep. And this idea that we're in exile is the idea that we are not in God's place, under God's rule, God's people under God's place, under God's rule. So that would be the Jerusalem, the Israel. And so in the Old Testament, this idea that, they flourished when they were under God's rule, they obeyed God's rule in God's place.
Yes.
And yet exile was a punishment for their disobedience. And so exile, when they were in exile in Babylon, they were under a foreign king in a foreign land under foreign rule,
right,
and working out how do we live as God's people in this foreign concept where we are not the power structure, we are not in charge, it's not God's right monarchy on the throne. How do we live in that space? And so that's a big theme here of this idea of exile is, which again for an American church can be quite confronting because there is a large history of American exceptionalism where, America is almost like the new Israel. It's God's place. There's all these kind of creational myths of America through the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and that this is, America will be the light shining on a hill that shines out to the world how good God is and how wonderful it is to be a Christian, and it will be a Christian nation amongst everything. And so
I expected some of that evangelical stuff you were talking about.
Well, yeah, and this is where it can go wrong again, is where there's this too close a tie of politic and religion.
Yep.
And so what Kinnaman and many, many others have talked about is this actually America perhaps is not Israel, a new Israel, maybe it's a new Babylon, for a number of particularly evangelicals who have grown up thinking that America is the new Israel and it's the light shining on a hill. That's massively
grating, really
grating. Yeah, like it shifts the mind.
And probably fear-inducing in a sense.
Well, yeah, people can be quite afraid of it, and also, for some it might be, you're giving up. Like, actually, no, we should be fighting for another Christian America. And
Christian nation,
Yeah, you get this other trend in American Christianity of the Christian nationalist kind of mode, which is, no, America is designed by God specifically and special in the world to be a Christian nation, to shine the light, and therefore we need to reclaim that through politics and through power. And so that would be another take on this. So these, different perspectives on what is America, who is America meant to be. I think it's interesting as Australians, we kind of look on both of these and go, this is a curious, very American-centric conversation, as you said.
Got a reasonably short view of history as well.
Well, that's true as well. There wouldn't be many in Australia, certainly I don't think in our circles, who would think that Australia is this light shining on a hill. We are destined by God to be uniquely Christian in the globe and shine God's light. That's never been part of our mythology of who we are as a country. And so even though we are Western, we are a democracy, and Christianity has been a significant part of the cultural makeup of Australia. It just expresses in a different way, and I think both for our secular world and for our Christians in Australia, that we don't sort of tend to fall into those same traps, I don't think.
I agree, yeah. And that's where, in reading this book, I do feel like, that doesn't feel very applicable sometimes.
Yeah, he's arguing against a story that has never been our story.
That's it.
I think that is part of that disconnect for us.
Yeah, and that's probably my battle. I know, admittedly, I've only read the first chapter and a half, but just going back to what you're talking about in terms of the Jerusalem versus Babylon argument, he says, we believe many parents, educators, pastors, and other leaders are trying to prepare young Christians for Jerusalem to keep them safe and well protected for a world they no longer live in. Like that's the danger. And part of his research, basically they pulled out 4 different types of exiles, they call them. So they've been part of the church and are either no longer going to church, or it's part of that very much America is a Christian nation idea. So his research, as I said, touches on 18 to 29-year-olds a lot. One of the 4 main characters or kind of avatars that he pulls out from that are prodigals, who are ex-Christians who don't identify as Christian but attended a church at some point. Nomads, who are unchurched, they identify as Christian but have not attended church in the past month. Just pointing that out. It's funny how the National Church Life Survey basically says a regular churchgoer is someone who's gone to the church in the past month.
Yep.
I should say prodigals is 22% of his research, 30% is nomads, 38% are habitual churchgoers, those describe themselves as Christian, who attend church at least once in the past month, yet do not meet foundational core beliefs or behaviours associated with being an engaged disciple. And the final one, which is at 10%, and this is where he's trying to get to, is resilient disciples. So they are Christ followers who attend church at least monthly, engage with the church more than just attending worship, so serving in the church. They trust in the authority of the Bible, committed to Jesus personally and express a desire to transform the broader society as a result of their faith. And I find that interesting that he feels like he needs to pull that out, because I feel like in Australia, in comparison, the resilient disciples is probably even smaller, and everyone else falls into probably more the prodigal and nomad category more than anything else.
Well, it's interesting that all four of these are those who have grown up in the church as well.
Yes. So it's also an assumption that most people have grown up in the church.
Yeah, and I don't know if he gets into what percentage of young adults are in one of the... So how many young adults in America are in one of these four categories as opposed to not in one of these four categories at all?
Mm-hmm.
But he is really interested in... and another phrase would be retention, so faith retention. So for those who have grown up in church, how do you become someone who holds faith long term? So that's what he's really...
That resilient faith that he's talking about.
Resilient faith, yeah, that's what he's really interested in.
I think.
And so, but yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to know how those numbers differed in Australia for those who grew up in the Australian church. One of the biggest things, as you said, is there is not a high expectation in Australia that you would go to church unless you were really committed Christians. So, it's not culturally acceptable to go to church.
Or you'd be called religious. I find that often that term's used around. It's like, oh no, maybe not all the time. Oh, he or she's very religious, but they might not go to church. No, that's probably wrong.
Yeah, maybe. I think there would be some cultural or ethnic minorities in Australia for whom church attendance is part of their cultural identity that they might be more habitual churchgoers or unchurched if they get older and they have the freedom to not attend.
Yep.
I would say that for the Anglo population, most wouldn't have got to church at any point in their life. So I think that's a significant difference. In which case, Australia would be much more like some of the coastal secular cities in America. So like, you get your Portlands or your New York Cities or your...
Or in some European countries probably.
European countries, yes. Yeah. And often not quite as secular as European countries, but on the way. Yeah. So that's really interesting. Yeah. I think one of the really interesting things for Australia is going to be the rise in Christian schooling that there's a low trust in public education in Australia.
Interesting.
And so there's high uptake of independent schooling, the majority of which are Christians. That you do have some other faiths in there as well. And particularly, you've got low fee paying Christian schools where, some of the population makeup of those schools is 89% non-faith families who are going to these schools.
But it's just the ethics and values that are taught.
Yeah, or maybe it's just that we don't like the local public school, so we're looking for a better education. For some people, it's an elite thing, not high class elitism, but just if I can afford to pay for a private school, I will, because there's such low trust in public schooling.
The perception of a better education.
That's right. Yeah, it's perception of a better education. And so I've got friends who teach out at schools in Sydney's southwest, where it's very diverse in terms of racial, ethnic populations. In religious populations. And so you have some of these Christian schools, overtly Christian schools, 100% Christian staff. They have Christian studies every day. They do biblical studies. They do devotions. And yet 80% of the school population are not faith homes, including some from Islamic homes and Hindu homes and Sikh homes and all sorts of things who are coming to these schools. I think that's going to be really interesting to see in 20 years' time. What impact have those Christian schools that have largely catered for non-Christian families, has that moved the dial at all on religious understanding? Has that had much of an impact on the way that Australia thinks about religion? I think that's a sort of something to keep an eye on in the next 20 years, to think about these kids who are growing up in non-Christian homes, going to explicitly Christian schools. What's their faith understanding as they enter adolescence, young adulthood, and what on the negative side, there are those who suggest that they have just enough gospel to inoculate them against the actual truth claims. So it's like getting your vaccination, that you just get just enough so that the full force of commitment to Jesus as Lord and Saviour doesn't impact you in any way. On the more optimistic side, you've got those who are pouring a lot of time, attention, money, staffing into these schools because they see the missional opportunity, that there are those people who are willingly wanting their child to be part of this particular education setting. What a great opportunity to help them to see the true lordship of Christ and how wonderful Jesus is and the positive aspect of what it means to be a Christian, and seeing people, children and teenagers come to know Jesus as Lord and Saviour through that ministry. So they're kind of, extremes, and obviously, everyone's story is going to be somewhere along that spectrum. But I think that's going to be really interesting to think about, okay, how do I form resilient disciples? For some, how do we make disciples in the first place of children and teenagers? And then how do we take some of these principles to help build those resilient disciples in our churches?
Definitely, I think that Christian schools discussion is really important. As your children go to a Christian school, and my wife teaches at one.
Yes.
So that would be interesting to get that perspective. And as you're saying, the producing resilient disciples, it seems to be a really important discussion, what this book's trying to talk about. The most of the book is based around 5 practices that they think, and I don't mean to switch that, but I think what you're saying about Christian schools really plays into this a little bit, is there's 5 main practices, and this is where we'll end the episode, but we can continue to dive into this as we go. Practice 1, to form a resilient identity, experience intimacy with Jesus. And again, this talks so much about what we were talking about in terms of discipleship as well. So that's why I really enjoyed reading this first chapter. Practice 2, in a complex and anxious age, develop the muscles of cultural discernment. That's like you brought up that term, being confident Christians before.
Yes,
I think that plays
this one's really key. And I think this is a big part, again, of his argument. If we assume that the culture we're living on is more like Jerusalem and less like Babylon, then we will be less critical in our adoption of the culture. So
we'll just allow the culture to disciple us rather than the Bible.
So something I've said a number of times in different settings is, you go back a generation, even 2 generations, the overlap, if you think of Venn diagram, the overlap between being a good Australian and being a good Christian had a high degree of overlap.
Yep.
But that has been pulled further and further apart. And I think that is part of this idea of being in exile, is we can't assume that being a good Australian is being a good Christian. Now, if you've got an exile mindset, then you will assume that what I absorb from my Australian culture is counter being confidently Christian in this space. Whereas if I have more of a thinking, I'm in Jerusalem, I'm in God's promised land, Australia is a Christian nation, therefore being a good Australian, being a good Christian have a high degree of overlap, then I will be less critical in my cultural adoption of Australian thought, Australian values, those kinds of things. So I think that's a really key piece to his argument.
And I wonder if that differs between whether you've been raised in a Christian family or a non-Christian family. I feel like that may impact that differently. Because as soon as you speak, because you're from a Christian family, I'm from a non-Christian family, and as soon as I was doing, like I was in exile already.
Yes,
you know what I mean? I think that would be an interesting discussion to have around that. Anyway, there's 3 other practices, and this is one I think you'll enjoy too. Practice 3, when isolation and mistrust are the norms, forge meaningful intergenerational relationships.
There you go.
There it is. It's Dave Kinnaman's confirmed, but what Tim's always talking about is correct.
Yep. Good on you. Thanks for agreeing with me, David.
So I look forward to reading that chapter.
Definitely not the other way around.
Yeah, that's right. Practice 4, to ground and motivate an ambitious generation, train for vocational discipleship. Very interesting. So training is really important, and raising up leaders, very important.
Yep.
Practice 5, curb entitlement and self-centered tendencies by engaging in countercultural mission.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I'm guessing that's to work hard against kind of the individualistic elements of society or our culture that we have right now. Anyway, so much to talk about.
Yep.
Hopefully I made those links work.
No, I think so, yeah.
Because the Vygotsky thing of got to be close to each other to disciple each other. We can't just be at church for 1 hour a week. We've got to be closer and spend more time with each other.
Yes.
And there's plenty more to get into discipleship, especially whether we're in Jerusalem or exiled in a digital Babylon. But we'll leave it at that point. for this particular episode. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Joel.
As always love talking to you. And you always bring out the best in me. Probably not the other way around, though. But if you've got any questions, thank you to Dave Stone Street, who is the principal of Shire Christian School. Is that correct?
He is.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I wasn't sure.
emailed in about a couple of weeks ago about the sash. Gave me a couple of other examples of Jesus wearing the sash. Remember how Jesus had the sash across?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we can get
Thank
into
you,
that.
David.
And we might see if we might get Dave on the podcast at some point. That would be unreal. Anyway, plenty more to talk about. We'll be back next week. If you do want to chat to me, email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au. Thank you very much for listening or watching. And thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
One way.
One way.